The two biggest Warhammer 40k games, Darktide and Space Marine. Picking them up against each other might seem like insanity to you because, well, they are in their own right very special titles for different reasons. But actually, the similarities course between both of them. Darktide released in November of 2022. In fact, it was on my birthday and it was a very special day. Space Marine 2 came out last month and in fact has been one of my favourite titles in the last few years. It is absolutely incredibly visceral, fast-paced and gorgeous. And as I've been playing both of them recently, I started to notice, wow, these two games are more similar than you'd think. First of all, I adore both of these titles, but for very, very different reasons. While some of their gameplay style and, of course, visuals, not to mention the setting, are identical in a lot of ways, I think they do, however, offer both very different experiences because of the combination. Some of the intricate parts of them you can relate to each other between both titles, but the amalgamation that make up the majority of both games go branch off somewhere along the 40k line. They're both, of course, set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It's grim, it's dark, and it's intense, but the way they portray them can be very different. We're set within a hive city within Darktide. It is one of the most brutal scenarios that I've ever seen in terms of horror shooters. Of course, it's not the jump out of your seat scary pants titles that you might expect from an Amnesia or, of course, well, Resident Evil. I'm too much of a pussy to play those games. However, it does offer those elements of being this Imperial Guard trying to clear out this plague and infestation within the hive city. Space Marine 2, it offers something that's just as brutal, but you're actually the one causing most of the mayhem. The focus on visceral, fast-paced combat flows between both of them with very much a simulation of horde enemies. Both of them you'd find against swarms of AI, and of course with co-op in both titles. Darktide has just co-op mode, but Warhammer 40k does really push it as one of its main features, fighting off thousands and thousands of Tyranids at once as they cascade on top of each other, trying to get to you, and, well, this moves throughout the whole of the campaign, even when you start fighting the Chaos a little bit later on. Both with more grunt enemies, some heavier warrior enemies, some ranged enemies, and of course bosses that you're going to have to fight. There's a strong emphasis on both ranged and melee combat throughout both of them. I think Darktide mostly tips it when it comes to melee combat just because it has that smaller tunnel-based gameplay. That's just the way that the maps are made, so most of the time you're going to be able to shoot a little bit, but you get pretty close and personal to your enemies before you can even notice, so hacking and slashing is almost imperative every 3 seconds. Because of the scale, you're going to be finding a lot more gunplay within Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 than you would within the Darktide variant. Atmospheric visuals are so true in both these titles to the Warhammer 40k lore. I think both of them really feed and deepen your knowledge of Warhammer 40k, but I do think Space Marine leans into it a little bit more on that case. Mostly because it is this story-driven campaign, and this is where one of the main differences come through. Space Marine 2 is definitely more, focusing on its story, its characters, and trying to teach people about the lore. Whether it's fighting against Tyranids and all the variants of the Gaunts or the Carnifex, or having Imperial Guards on your side later being affected by the warp and having the Mechanicus lads, different types of Astartes and chapters that it teaches you about, different vehicles like the old-fashioned rhinos or the new fun hovery rhinos. Then, of course, the way that sorcerers are implemented within the story, fighting in the warp and against the Chaos Gods. I mean, it is absolutely fantastic the way that they integrate the Warhammer lore into the title, and I definitely think that they do it way better than Darktide does. Just because, well, it's limited a lot less. The scale of these games is one of the main points that is incomparable. Whilst they do both have horde combat, Space Marine looks like this and Darktide looks like this. There isn't too much of a comparison between these things. The size comparison is so noticeable. Being a third-person game, of course, Space Marine does give you that feeling that you are following this huge, hulking Space Marine character. You are incredibly heroic, it is incredibly epic, and you feel like you have this power fantasy being fed to you throughout the whole of the story. Darktide is almost the antithesis of this. It is a first-person horror co-op-focused game where you are not the hero of the story. You are the cog in a machine. It is terrifying heading into these hive cities, as pretty much any enemy in this can kill you pretty easily. You have to use every ability you have, so many revives from your friends, and of course all the weapons that you can muster, not to mention explosives and using the terrain and the maps, trying to get up high to defend against certain enemies or choke point them out the way. And then it is so much more terrifying when a boss comes around the corner. Because of the larger scale of Space Marine 2, if there is a Carnifex, you can run away. He'll go after one of your teammates. You can go and heal, that sort of thing. Get some shots from afar before going back in or using one of your various abilities. In Darktide, you can't run anywhere. There is nowhere to run. Not just that, but you go down in 2 or 3 hits within that title from a boss, and you can't see them properly because it's so dark. The darker horror survival tone is so much more grounded and grim within Darktide, hence the name, meaning that you do feel so much more powerless than you ever do in Space Marine 2. Titus is an Astartes, and he does feel like it. You can stomp through pretty much any enemy within this game, and especially as you get to the final levels and start doing operations after you've completed the story, you have everything from power swords to thunder hammers to melters, multi-melters. It goes on and on and on with the variations of weapons. And in Darktide, well, you have a lasgun if you're lucky, and you maybe an axe as well, trying to fight off as many poxwalkers as possible. You see, the difference is, with Darktide within the story, you're told to just clear out this horde. We need to send many of these prisoners in as possible just to clear out this infestation of the Hive City. In Space Marine 2, you are given every weapon in the arsenal, as you are one of the highest power Space Marines on the battle barge at this point in time. It's almost trying to compare a god to the guy that works in the sewer. That is a huge difference. But let's talk a little bit about the mechanics. We've talked about the horde mechanics and how they are similar in some ways and apart from the scale, but especially when it comes to melee combat, there's a lot of fluid transitions in Space Marine 2 between melee and ranged. You do also feel like this one-man army sometimes, but Darktide requires a lot more strategic teamwork and balancing of the classes. Like, you have your tank, you have your sniper, you have your supports, and of course your psychers as well. You have to make sure you're all using them to the best of the abilities, and of course when you're playing with your friends, making sure that people have picked classes that can emphasize or fill in the gaps of the classes that are or aren't there. Space Marine 2, it doesn't really matter. You're going to be stomping through people anyway. When it comes to my personal enjoyment, honestly, I would jump into these titles for very different reasons. If I wanted an incredible challenge that is really focused on multiplayer first, and of course playing with my mates, Darktide is where I'll go every single time. I mean, the Warhammer Vermintide franchise in general has been fantastic. In fact, I kind of do prefer Vermintide 2 over Darktide just because of the setting and, well, it's had a little bit more content. Not to mention that Darktide in general has had a bit of friction between its community and, of course, its developers. Something that we haven't come across in Space Marine 2, which has been widely, well, incredibly well received and praised by fans and critics alike. But if I want that hardcore, in-depth, scary, and pretty tricky experience, I'll always jump into Darktide. But if I want something that makes me feel like the biggest and ultimate badass, that follows a decent story, and if I want to get excited by the lore and the grandeur of Warhammer 40k, well, Space Marine 2 is where I go. And those are the two biggest differences. Space Marine 2 has a focus on the scale of 40k, and Darktide has a focus on the individuals of 40k. Both, I think, are absolutely fantastic games. But if I'm going to put it as simply as possible, Darktide doesn't have as much content. That's it. If you want content, go for Space Marine 2. That is my entire conclusion for this video.